Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospect of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 22nd of May 2025, Professor Sonia Sedivy of the University of Toronto addresses Kant's understanding of the way we make and experience judgments of beauty. She argues that, contrary to appearances, Kant's account of aesthetic judgments, particularly in relation to his notion of the free play of the imagination and understanding, as well as his notion of the aesthetic idea, fits well with contemporary thinking about beauty and nature and art. This is particularly the case, Sedivy argues, when it concerns our intuitions about individuality and disagreement in aesthetic judgment.
So welcome everyone to this, our second to last meeting before we pause for the summer. Next up is Ryan Doran, who will join us June 5th. Guy, correct me if I got the date wrong, which I often do. So it's a great pleasure to have with us today Sonia Sedivy, professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto, where she has supervised many dissertations in aesthetics and related area. I happen to know that she's a generous and, in fact, immensely patient PhD supervisor. Thanks again for putting up with me those many years ago, Sonia. Her primary research interests are in philosophy of perception, aesthetics, and the later Wittgenstein. Much of her work concerns beauty and the nature of aesthetic properties. She's the author of the excellent Beauty and the End of Art, Wittgenstein, Plurality and Perception, and editor of Art, Representation, and Make-Believe, Essays on the Philosophy of Kendall Walton, which some of us here had the privilege of being included in. It's a really, really lovely volume. She is currently writing a book titled Perception, Understanding, and Aesthetics, which clearly aligns her research with the focus of our working group here very, very nicely. Today, we'll be talking about her excellent essay, In or Out of Tune, Kant and Contemporary Views in Aesthetics, which I suspect is taken from the book she's currently writing. It gives us a chance to think about something clearly relevant to our ongoing conversation here, but which has not been on the menu yet, namely the Kantian notion of an aesthetic idea. So thank you very much for joining us, Sonia. And I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much for having me. And I should just say, John was a self-mover. I had nothing to do. He was just a dream PhD student who did everything by himself, and I was sort of along for the ride. So all that wonderful work that came out in Skepticism and the Weave of Life is John's work. So I'm so happy to be here again. This paper on Kant and Contemporary Views in Aesthetics is actually for a journal issue. I was asked to contribute a paper. It was on Kant and contemporary aesthetics. No, contemporary analytic philosophy. What am I saying? So I kind of thought about it for a while, and then I took the plunge. And so what I'm arguing in this paper, and I made the longer version available. I'm really going to compress a lot of it to about half. But the idea is, and I won't go into the details, we have this sense that Kant's views in the critique of judgment in the first half, the critique of aesthetic judgment, are just sort of totally at odds with the ethos today. You know, Kant doesn't allow for understanding or conceptual understanding or richly informed historical understanding. He seems to shunt us off into some horrible contemplative attitude. So it just seems like what we think about art and aesthetics more broadly just is really at odds with what was going on in the critique of judgment. I actually don't think that that's the case. And so that's what I'm trying to show in this paper. And let me just see if I can actually share my screen. So I have a very basic PowerPoint, not much razzle dazzle to it. To show that Kant's views are quite in tune with recent trends in aesthetics and the arts, I'm going to highlight two recent interpretive trends. And the first one is to focus on, a number of interpreters focus on Kant's view that judgments of beauty are grounded in a harmonious and free play of our faculties of imagination and understanding. The second interpretive trend highlights Kant's view, now not in the analytic, but after the deduction, that beauty in general, both artistic and natural, expresses aesthetic ideas, and that this is a key part of his view rather than some subsidiary afterthought. And so what I want to do in this paper is to show that these views actually work together. They support one another, and they help us see how well Kant's view, if we put these two together, is in tune with some of our own views and commitments. So I'm going to keep the first section, presenting some textual and interpretive background, very brief. There's more in the written section. And the second part, I'm just going to focus on trying to show that Kant's view accommodates richly informed responsiveness to art. And then in the second, very brief section, I'm going to try to suggest that I think actually Kant gives us a superb account of the individuality of our responses to the beautiful, as well as great accounts of error and disagreement. So let's just briefly do a bit of the brief background. So as you all know, Kant's larger aim in the critique of judgment is to show that our capacity for judgment, for thinking the particular under the universal, is warranted. So this is the overarching aim, and it concerns the warrant for our ability to form empirical concepts and to subsume appropriate particulars under appropriate concepts. And to this end, the first half of the critique offers an account of what Kant calls pure aesthetic judgments, whose distinguishing feature is that they're grounded in feeling rather than cognition. That's what makes them unique. And specifically, pure aesthetic judgments are grounded in the feeling of the harmonious and free play of the faculties of imagination and understanding. Now, Kant introduces the free play in the opening analysis of the first conditions or moments that distinguish judgments of beauty. And he argues that such judgments are universal and communicable precisely because they're grounded in the feeling of free play of our capacities. Unlike other sensory states that we may have, the feeling of free play is communicable and universal because this reciprocal harmonious activity of imagination understanding is one of the conditions of cognition. And if something's one of the conditions of cognition, it's communicable. This is sort of the very idea, as it were. Now, we can see that the notion of free play builds on Kant's fundamental commitment that experience involves the application of concepts to a sensory manifold. But his innovation concerning judgments of beauty is that such judgments are not fully constrained by concepts, yet the normal conditions of conceptually informed perceptual experience and cognition are operative. Indeed, the reciprocal activity of the two, imagination and understanding, are heightened. But the activity remains reflective in Kant's terms, which means it doesn't subsume the work of the imagination under a specific concept so that it does not issue in a proper determinative judgment. And Kant argues that what we find pleasurable is the free play. In his words, the judgment of free play precedes the pleasure does not precede and ground the judgment. But the point is about grounding, and this is Kant's Copernican revolution or reversal in aesthetics. The point is to show that though judgments of beauty are not grounded in pleasure, which can have no claims to universal agreement, such judgments can nevertheless be grounded in subjective feeling, and a subjective feeling of the sort that can claim universality. Okay, so that's, I hope, enough background just to get our minds back into Kant and oriented. Okay, so I've sort of asked us to think about the free play of imagination understanding, and you might very well ask, well, what evokes such free play? And Kant gives two compatible, and I want to say mutually supporting answers. In his analysis of judgments of beauty, Kant turns to the object or its presentation to argue that what we respond to in beautiful things is their purpose of form rather than their purpose of function. So they seem as if they are designed and as if they're designed to evoke the free play. Now, as is well known, insofar as beautiful things evoke a harmonious free play, Kant suggests in the analytic, in the opening part of the critique, that it's organization or structure that evokes such a free play, but he goes further and he seems to propose too narrowly that it's only spatiotemporal forms that evoke free play, even though what his position requires is just structure or organization. And then if we turn to the second half of the critique of aesthetic judgment following the deduction, Kant details that it's aesthetic ideas that evoke the free play. And he makes this wonderfully strong claim: beauty in general expresses aesthetic ideas through aesthetic attributes. So this is what is evoking the free play. Okay, now here's some Kant. In a word, an aesthetic idea is a presentation of the imagination which is conjoined with a given concept and is connected, when we use imagination in its freedom, with such a multiplicity of partial representations that no expression that stands for a determinate concept can be found for it. Hence, it's a presentation that makes us add to a concept the thoughts of much that's ineffable, but the feeling of which quickens our cognitive powers and connects language which otherwise would be mere letters with spirits. So aesthetic ideas expand our concepts beyond their empirical or logical conditions by means of the aesthetic attributes, which the imagination conjoins with the presentations and which arouse a multitude of sensations and supplementary presentations. So the key is that when this is going on, the activity of the imagination is free. When the imagination is used for cognition, then it's under the constraint of the understanding and is subject to the restriction of adequacy to the understanding's concept. But when the aim is aesthetic, then the imagination is free, so that over and above that harmony with the concept, it may supply in an unstudied way a wealth of undeveloped material for the understanding which the latter disregarded in its concept. So in short, beautiful things express aesthetic ideas that expand our concepts beyond conditions that can be obtained from empirical evidence, and they do so by means of aesthetic attributes that enliven the imagination into free activity. So I want to now try to show how these two ideas of Kant's work together. Aesthetic ideas help explain free play, and free play helps explain aesthetic ideas. So on the one hand, we can understand aesthetic ideas as what sets our imagination and understanding into a harmonious, free activity. They require the presentational activity of the imagination, but they also require some cooperative activity of the understanding. Otherwise, the imagination would just be playing by itself. It wouldn't be playing with the understanding. So in short, it's because beauty expresses ideas rather than offering only structure or organization that a free play is unleashed, where imagination is mutually quickened with the activity of the understanding while remaining free rather than being constrained by the conditions of concepts. And on the other hand, if we go the other way, paying close attention to Kant's proposal that beauty expresses aesthetic ideas helps explain that a judgment of beauty is grounded in a free play precisely because aesthetic ideas strive towards something that lies beyond the bounds of experience. So Kant writes that an artist ventures to give sensible expression to rational ideas of invisible beings, the realm of the blessed, the realm of hell, eternity, creation, and so on. And this may make it seem like aesthetic ideas are just restricted to the same sorts of topics as rational ideas, you know, the big few, God, eternity, freedom. But Kant goes on. Or again, he, the artist, takes things that are indeed exemplified in experience, such as death, envy, and all the vices, as well as love, fame, and so on. But then, by means of an imagination that emulates the example of reason in reaching for a maximum, he ventures to give these sensible expression in a way that goes beyond the limits of experience, namely, by striving for a completeness for which no example can be found in nature. So, judgments of beauty aren't just responses to a beautiful thing, natural or artistic. They respond to the aesthetic ideas that a beautiful thing or its presentation expresses through its aesthetic attributes. So here's an example. I hope it will work for you. Maybe you'll tell me afterwards that it really doesn't. So, but here's me. I found this particular sculpture beautiful. Soul trained by Gems Coco B at the Ivory Coast Pavilion at the Venice Biennale last year, 2024. Its beauty doesn't just consist in relationships among its spatial forms, but in the aesthetic ideas it expresses through its aesthetic attributes. The elongated prostrate body, made of long pieces of wood that look like creosote-soaked railway ties, fills up this floor space at the Ivory Coast Pavilion. Face down, the long fragmented limbs and body parts bear warped all segments of railway tracks lying atop. Head barely struggling to lift from the ground, one arm grasps the railway track on its back. The only slightly shaped long limbs and torso are not sentimental, I think. Curved only slightly beyond the rectangular lines of railway tracks, the body doesn't tug at heartstrings, yet it's deeply moving. The work expands on my understanding of subjugation, to put a word on it, though saying this immediately feels trite, since using the concept bypasses the way the specific attributes expand on my understanding of what I can only gesture to using that concept. Okay, maybe you're okay so far, but here's a problem for focusing on the way that the two proposals work together. Someone might object that the suggestion that aesthetic ideas are mutually explanatory with free play fall afoul of Kant's distinction between judgments of adherent and free beauty. And there's lots of readings to this effect, which say that basically anything Kant does in the deduction and later just is kind of blocked by him laying down this distinction between free beauty and adherent beauty, or free judgments of beauty and adherent judgments. And I want to suggest that it's really important to follow both Paul Guyer and Henry Allison's arguments to the contrary, which have been around for about 40 years. So in Allison's words, by drawing this distinction, Kant is setting up, and this quote is not yet on the screen, so you don't have to struggle. Kant is setting up the contrast between two ways in which the beauty of an object, which as such is always the object of a pure judgment of taste, is to be considered either solely in its own terms, or as an ingredient in a larger whole, which involves the thought of the purpose served by the object. A pure judgment of taste, and here's our quote, can enter into more complex forms of evaluation in which it plays a subordinate role without compromising its inherent purity. And here's Paul Guyer, who emphasizes that though the concept of an object constrains or restricts what we can find beautiful in it, we must still experience a free play of imagination and understanding, and thus we still have a genuine response to beauty and can make a genuine judgment of taste. Why is that? Because if you look at the top of the screen, we have a two-way distinction. This is beautiful. This is a beautiful canyon, right? That's the adherent case. But obviously, those logically are not the only options. We also have this canyon is beautiful. Now, Kant is interested in working on the predicate. The predication is beautiful. It's the predication that's grounded in feeling rather than cognition. That's the whole point of his exercise. That's what he's working on. And the is beautiful predication allows that the subject term can be more complex than a this. That's just sort of basic, right? S is P. So that's why both Guyer and Allison are arguing that, look, there's a more complex structure here. The subject term can be more complex and the predication can remain is beautiful. We have another option, and in a way, the second half of the critique does explore this because it's working with experience of art, for example, and Kant is explicit that you have to understand that something is an artwork to respond appropriately. So in other words, you have that second option there, this artwork is beautiful, as opposed to this is beautiful or this is a beautiful artwork, right? So I think that's the space in which we're operating. Okay. So now let's go to our second section where we might ask, okay, all this is fine and good, but really, how detailed can our understanding of an artwork, of its kind and its content be? Now, I argue that Kant's view is consistent with a pretty strong historicism about both kinds and contents. We can't sort of get into the kinds artwork like sculpture or installation or architecture, what have you. Here, let's just look at the content. Yes? Okay, so how detailed can conceptually and specifically historical understanding that enters into one's aesthetic judgment be? And let's look at my example of Soul Train again. So my experience is not subsumed under a specific concept that the prostrate, elongated body conveys, for example, subjugation, or even an expansion, such as subjugation is harmful. Conceptually, that's not news. If the work was readily subsumable under this concept, it would not stop me in my tracks. I would not spend extended minutes with the work, walking around, pausing, engaging different parts or the whole from different perspectives, not wanting to leave it behind. In Kant's terms, okay, I've just put it in my own experience. In Kant's terms, what's going on is that the aesthetic attributes, such as the elongated limbs splayed downwards, their specific curves, positioning, gestures, and dark color, expand on my concept of subjugation beyond the bounds of what I conceptually understand. These attributes spark my imaginative activity. I keep going over all the parts, moving around, taking them in from various perspectives and in different orders, drawing them together in different ways, while perhaps also imagining other presentations. And my understanding, for example, my grasp of the relevant historical facts is in play no less. Now, Kant's view is consistent here with the view that specific historical factors often or typically inform the ideas a work conveys, and by means of which sorts of aesthetic attributes. Think about Soul Train. Historical understanding, I think, is critical. If someone had never encountered a railroad track or had no knowledge whatsoever of the modern history of slavery, their aesthetic response would be limited at best. Now, Kant's examples of beautiful works that express aesthetic ideas through aesthetic attributes countenance historical understanding. So here's a quotation. Fine art shows its superiority to beautiful nature precisely in this, that it describes things beautifully that in nature we would dislike or find ugly. The furies, diseases, devastations of war, and so on are all harmful, and yet they can be described or even presented in a painting very beautifully. So the devastations of war in a particular painting or a novel are specific historical or fictional events. In either case, our responsiveness to a specific beautiful description or depiction involves some understanding of its situation. And if the painting or novel is of an actual rather than a fictional war or disease, it involves some historical understanding of its contents. And you can see how Kant's examples in this passage also support interpreting aesthetic ideas as sensible expansions of subjects that are not restricted to the few rational ideas, such as those of God or freedom. Okay, so as Kant goes on to say, and we're elaborating now this key idea of an aesthetic idea, the proper function of an aesthetic idea is to quicken the mind by opening up for it a view into an immense realm of kindred presentations. But Kant countenances, as we've seen, a variety of subjects such as wars and diseases that a beautiful work might present and expand beyond the logical conditions of concepts. As he puts it, the main reason for calling those presentations ideas is that they are inner intuitions to which no concepts can be completely adequate. Aesthetic ideas are presentations that go beyond or surpass nature. They strive for completeness that goes beyond what we can conceive in nature. Now, as the final step in this section, let's turn to natural things are seen, and Kant's perhaps puzzling suggestion that they express aesthetic ideas through aesthetic attributes. Is this really sensible? So consider my visit to Upper Antelope Canyon a year and a half ago. These are my photos. They're not great, but they're the best I have. So now when you go to Upper Antelope Canyon, you're required to take a guided tour that carefully limits the number of visitors and their movement through the canyon. And the tour also begins with an explanation of the formation of the just extraordinarily beautiful curving shapes of the 100-foot deep canyon across a distance of about over 600 feet. Now, the explanation, in short, is that across millions of years, what starts as a tiny crack in the earth from a bit of frozen water grows each year a little bit more moisture, freezing and expanding the crack and creating the canyon, while winds blowing through the growing canyon create those curving, swirling shapes. So we all understood conceptually what we were immersed in. But this had no effect on the fact that the beautiful shape simply blew one's mind. My understanding was engaged, but it was also inept. My imagination could not be more active, constantly searching through the curves and their melding transformations. And my understanding was also, engaged in this sort of how is it possible thought, even though it had just been explained to you. Now, I think Kant's notion of the free play of imagination and understanding captures my experience. But does the canyon express aesthetic ideas through its aesthetic attributes? Surely it expands on our sense of nature's purposiveness for us, our sense that nature is thinkable, even as its fully specific beauty eludes us. Okay, so now let's wrap up quickly with the third section. And, even if maybe you found the reading in the previous sections congenial, it may still seem that Kant's emphasis on the universality of aesthetic judgments just can't be squared with contemporary discomfort with universal aesthetic claims. So I want to take this in a few steps. And I think that Kant's work actually does tremendously well when it comes to individuality, disagreement, and error. And especially, I think his views terrific for explaining the individuality and differences in our responses to beauty. His emphasis that beautiful things set the imagination free from the laws of association proposes that we respond with a kind of activity, yes, the free play of imagination understanding, whose exercises are such that they differ in each and every case, right? So any exercise of the free play of imagination understanding will be different across each individual and even across each occasion. If we go to a concert or a gallery together, I expect that your responses will be different. And this is part of the delight. Even if we're arrested by the same works, your response will invariably differ, at least somewhat, from mine. Kant explains this. Similarly, on a hike, I'm keen to see what you notice and how it strikes you. Again, I know it will be different, and that's why it's wonderful to hike with someone. Now, consider the account of aesthetic error and disagreement that Kant's approach suggests. If I incorrectly affirm that something is beautiful, I have mistaken my mental activity for the free enlivening of imagination and understanding. So this is a case of mistaken recognition. I misrecognize my own state or my own response. And lots of others have argued this. For example, Henry Allison emphasizes this. In contrast, it seems to me, if I incorrectly deny that something is beautiful, my imagination and understanding fail to enter into a free enlivening play. So Kant's approach suggests that one misses out on an activity in response to an object and its features. And I think this comes pretty close or captures our sense that when we don't find something beautiful, we're missing out on an experience rather than that we're straightforwardly wrong. Now, how about disagreement? When you and I disagree, one of us may be missing out. Maybe we're both missing out. There's all kinds of permutations if you look at what I've said about error and individuality. But is it appropriate to charge that insofar as we don't find all the same things beautiful, we find each other defective? This is Nehemiah's really strong charge against Kant's view that we ought to agree. If I fail to subsume something under its correct kind, baby duck, for example, my use of concepts, my understanding is defective, right? If I point to a baby goose and say, that's a baby duck, I'm defective. Okay. But remember, Kant denies that aesthetic judgments work this way. Step one, the opening paragraphs of the Critique of Judgment say that aesthetic judgments are not like logical judgments. And I think this entails that the nature of error and disagreement must also be different. Yes? If the judgment is different in kind, if the grounding of it, the functioning of it is different, then surely the error case and the disagreement case, it follows, would also be different. It's for us to figure out what that is. This is what I've tried to bring out. So what's the best explanation of the kind of error and disagreement that comes with subjectively grounded aesthetic judgments? I've suggested that this kind of error may be a kind of an error of omission. One misses out on the experience and a judgment. Okay. Last but not least, this is the second step. I have not yet really addressed the problem of universality. Ought everyone agree with me if I judge correctly? May we legitimately differ in what we find beautiful, correctly, as it were? So, Kant argues that our judgments are subjectively universal with a necessary force that demands universal assent. This entails that if one's judgment of beauty is correct, as far as I can tell, it has a universal force that requires that others ought to agree. So even though Kant's account explains, I think terrifically, the individuality in our responses to beautiful things, his account may seem too strong in requiring universal agreement. I think there's no denying that this is Kant's view. It's up to you whether you find it too strong or not, or against our current ethos. But I hope to have shown that Kant's account of aesthetic ought is more permissive, less restrictive, and more generous in the variation it allows and in its explanation of error and disagreement than it seemed. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Sonia.
Hi, David.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much for that. And it seems to me, I agree with almost everything you say. But what I'm interested in is something you didn't actually address. I mean, I think this move to bring together the account of pure and inherent beauty by taking the elements that contribute to inherent beauty and putting them into the subject that is then the thing that we find beautiful is a very, very important move. I like that a lot. And you, as you say, you take that from Alison and from Gaia. But one thing you didn't address, which I think could also be explained in these terms and might also back up what you want to say about how Kant would deal with disagreement, is one of the moments of the pure judgment of taste, namely purposelessness without purpose. And I take it that this is not, as it was taken by aestheticists, it's not claiming that the thing that we find beautiful cannot be something that has a purpose. It's saying that its purposiveness, if it has such, is going to be built into the thing of which we predicate beauty. So again, it's not that the subject of which we form a pure judgment of taste has to be something that lacks purpose. It's that its purpose, just like its historical nature, is built into the thing of which we predicate the pure judgment of taste. So all of these things that are supposedly ruled out by Kant can be accommodated as variants on the way you're reading inherent beauty. We build it into the subject, and it's that thing that then produces the free play. So do you think that that's another thing that we can explain in Kant's account that has led some people to, I think, read Kant as a formalist, read him as somebody who can't accommodate historicist readings, who can't accommodate the idea that some of the things that we find beautiful are things that have an essential purpose, and yet that has to somehow enter into the judgment. So I'm just interested in how you would respond to that.
Yes, I mean, if I'm understanding you, then yes, it's going into the subject term, not the predication. So think about, this is beautiful. This artwork is beautiful. This 19th century artwork is beautiful. This 19th century artwork that was lost and rediscovered in my neighbor's basement is beautiful, right? And we could just keep going, or we could put in important things like, you know, I don't know whatever historical facts you want into the subject term. And, you know, this is not unusual. I could say, this is sticky. This snail is sticky. This snail on my hosta is sticky. This snail that just ate my hosta is sticky, right? So this just shouldn't be controversial. Now, Allison gets into a fair bit of detail, picking up a section, because Kant gets into detail, right? Once you're sort of looking for it, you see it. So Kant gives a really long discussion about why the beauty of sculpture is free and the beauty of architecture isn't. So he thinks that the functionality, the really ultimately functional nature of a building, let's say as a shelter or a shelter for a more specific purpose, that will always constrain your experience and your judgment. So it will always constrain the is beautiful part. But he thinks that a sculpture, that's not the case. And so then we might think, why not? I mean, I took a shot at it in my book. What I came up with is that, look, if you think about an artwork, let's say a sculpture, what is its function? According to Kant, really, its function, we might say, is to express aesthetic ideas with aesthetic attributes. But we've just said that that is something that's not subsumable under a concept. So we do not have a clear concept under which, right, which can constrain the is beautiful predication. So I just want to say, you know, Kant himself problematized this. It's there. I think it just hasn't quite been recognized as such, except by, for example, Allison. I mean, Allison gets into this in detail, and so do other writers. So thank you. I think the detail is there, and it supports your addition. Yeah.
Excellent. So I have Christopher and then Guy.
Hi.
Great. Okay. Hi, Sonia. So I just had a question about how pleasure fits into this account, because it gets mentioned a couple of times. And I mean, just a couple of things I was thinking. I just want to know if you think this is a necessary part of a theory of beauty, and this is something we should be taking with Kant as well into our contemporary talk about beauty, because I don't know, there's a lot of views at the moment that are putting a bit of, putting pressure on having pleasure as a necessary part of any account of beauty or aesthetic value. And I couldn't, especially towards the end, like in the conclusion of the paper, it comes up, and I couldn't quite tell if you were wanting to push pleasure to the side or keep it in there. And also, I was just thinking, there's lots of ways you could think about like the experience of monsters in horror, something like The Mist and the John Carpenter film, that maybe creates, it's like it creates these sort of aesthetic ideas. I can see this mist, but I don't know what it is, and my concepts are kind of having to try and grasp at it, but it's anxiety inducing, and it's sort of it's not very pleasurable, might think. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about where that's fitting in with this reconstruction that you're putting forward.
Okay, so thank you for that. If I'm understanding the question, there is a kind of pleasure that's involved in experience of beauty. It is the pleasure of the free play. Right? I think that's just Kant's view. We may have lots of pleasures in response to horror films, in response to all kinds of things that are not pleasures of free play. Those maybe are allowed by Kant as incidental, but I think what is sort of, we might say necessary or constitutive, is that when you respond with the feeling of the free play, that is pleasurable. But that's kind of his really tight key move, saying it's the free play that precedes the pleasure, not the pleasure preceding the free play. I don't know if you're getting at that. But so really Kant, the way I think of what he's doing here is he's at an absolute outpost of experience, right? Maybe we're lucky, like, I got to go to Antelope Canyon and I spent like an hour there. How often does that happen? Or you listen to some music, or you see a glistening patch of rainy soaked sidewalk. Like, yeah, we get lucky and the world can be very beautiful, anything in it. But one might also not have this very much. And he's, I think, really talking about a kind of pleasure that is an outpost of experience. There's lots of other pleasures, but they would not be the feeling in which an aesthetic judgment is grounded, which allows it to be something that's a matter of warrant and discloses our warranted relationship to the world. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thank you.
So Guy thank you for that. So Guy and then Derek.
Thanks so much, Sonia. Really enjoyed
Sorry,
it.
excuse me. Guy and then Elizabeth. I must see. Yeah, and then Derek.
Thanks so much, and I really enjoyed the paper, and I think both the written paper and your presentation just now just say so clearly and elegantly some of the things that I'm sure many of us have been trying to convince students of for a long time. So very, very nice, and also rather useful to have in writing. So thank you very much for that. Just two quite quick questions. One is obviously, like, beauty, or the concept of beauty in Kant, is a kind of paradigm concept for aesthetic value, and people who today talk of beauty as being kind of one among many aesthetic concepts in this kind of post-Sibleysian framework, kind of like think of beauty as just one of many things, like, and they use this kind of like thin thick, but after Bernard Williams way to address the relation between them. And I was just wondering how you I assume you're kind of holding with Kant's view that beauty is kind of like the main paradigm for aesthetic value. How do we attach that to these other apparently thicker aesthetic concepts, such as gracefulness and the other ones that always come up? And the other one, very, very quickly, was part of the way you were analyzing this suggested to me that maybe it's more helpful in some ways to think of beauty less as a kind of an adjectival concept, where it's kind of like predicated of a thing, and more as an adverbial concept, where we predicate it of the way things appear, or how we are looking or perceiving then I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
So this is a big story. I'm not a huge fan of paradigms, maybe I should say. I don't think of beauty as paradigmatic. I really think it's kind of out there as a pretty extreme case of a way that we can respond. There are times in history where we think of beauty as kind of the way we're thinking of aesthetic value. But I think aesthetic value can be very, very diverse. And so I'm actually working on sort of a higher order notion of aesthetic value, which can take diverse, specific aesthetic values, can subsume them. I already tried to do that in my book, but I was restricting myself there to perceptible beauty. So I had perceptible beauty as a very higher order beauty, which can subsume very specific local, historical, varied beauties. I don't know if that makes sense. So I don't think I would want to squeeze everything I would try to say about aesthetic value out of the notion of beauty, because I don't think there is one notion. I think it's actually quite historically diverse, though we need a way of putting them together. I also wouldn't take everything from Kant. So for example, I think aesthetic value, and I think this is true of beauty, and it's quite different from Kant. I think it's very permissive. I think actually it's a permissive kind of value rather than a requiring one. So I think that I have tried to be a cheerleader for Kant in this talk, and I think I took it as far as I can. And then I think there are a few places where, I think we can do more and do some things differently. So I think that's my resistance to saying that I think I'm not comfortable with taking Kantian account of beauty as a paradigm. I think it's fantastic in so many ways, but I think we do need to add and change it a little. Is that what you were asking?
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Just a brief comment, really, that I'd love the opportunity to discuss with you more at some point. But I think, when you read Kant against the background of the rationalists, so much of what you say now makes more sense than if you pick up the Critique of the Power of Judgments and you're, surprised by the concepts and the kind of general taxonomy or psychological explanations that Kant offers. Of course, he's trying to make sense of the fact that that aesthetic judgments aren't a kind of logical judgment or cognitive judgment or something that can be reduced to a judgment about whether something, meets its purpose or not. He's trying to introduce that kind of free play. He's trying to introduce a pleasure which is also not necessarily entirely cognitive. So I think just quickly to say that I think you're right. I mean, there is still talk of purposiveness, although it's without a clear, distinct purpose. There's still clear talk of dependent beauty. There's talk of rules of art. So I think just with that backdrop, your account makes a lot more sense that if we read Kant's aesthetics from the point of view of the 20th or 21st century, philosophical starting points.
Thank you. Can I just add one thought to that? That I think Kant is really kind of walking this tightrope, where I think our explanations of beauty have to walk, which is that you you have to show that the experiences or judgments are neither too conceptual and interpretive, nor too sensuous and a matter of pleasure, right? And I think that so many, at least I understand so many theorists of beauty as doing this, and I think of them as tipping over on either side. Yes, too cognitive, too interpretive, too pleasurable, too sensuous. And what I find so wonderful in Kant is, especially with the notion of the free play of imagination and understanding, is just how he walks that tightrope. And at least to me, it seems pretty successfully without tipping either way. Now, if I was going to sort of get bolder, I might say, hey, this is what perception does, right? But that's a further story. So some of us see in Kant's work here really an account of perception or perception at its limits. For example, Carla Marix, I only discovered recently, well, a few years ago, and I felt really badly because it was after I did my book, that Amarix has a fantastic suite of papers where he argues that Kant is talking about perception here, right? Because you do have to have this incredible cooperation, which can never fully mesh between your capacity for concepts and your capacity for determinate presentations. So yes, thank you for that.
Thank you. Nils.
Nils, hi.
I'm sorry to disappoint, but it's actually Panos.
Yeah, I do apologize. Yes. So thank you very much. I just wanted to press possibly a bit more on the question that Chris and I think also kind of Guy was thinking about. And so
Okay.
I'm really interested in this idea of aesthetic ideas. I mean, I generally feel like I'm trying to get as far away from Kant as I can, but find myself somehow seeming to say similar things. But so here's the thought. Among the aesthetic ideas, examples include hell and diseases and all of that, right? And as Chris said, there's in the way we think about beauty today, but I think even Kant would have accepted that because he distinguishes between the beautiful and the sublime. The sublime is not entirely pleasurable, the beautiful is. Hume would probably think similarly, right? There are tragic things don't please us, but they convert to beauty through pleasure or whatever. So beauty as a quality, as opposed to aesthetic value, more broadly, which includes, as you said, and I agree, lots of diverse qualities, some of which may not be pleasing, at least in my mind. I don't know if that's true of Kant. Beauty is distinguished partly at least by the fact that it elicits pleasure. And as you said, that pleasure may well be grounded in the free play and all of that. Now, the problem for me that I kind of struggle with is that if you have genuine expressions of the aesthetic ideas of war and disease and so on, then it's not going to be pleasurable. I can't work out whether or not there's going to be free play. I suspect if free play is pleasurable, then there isn't, because in my experience, there is no pleasure in seeing sort of Goya's Disasters of War series, for instance. And it seems like because the way he phrases it is beautifully, I don't know what the German is there, but we can think of sort of an equivalent to Goya's Disasters of War, sort of drawn more beautifully or beautified, as we might put it. And that, of course, would be from a dependent beauty perspective, it would be a negative thing, right? It would be aesthetically disvaluable. So there's a few things going on there that don't quite, in my mind, go well together. So the expression of aesthetic ideas that are clearly negative with the arousal of pleasure, and in the context of aesthetic value, and yeah. So hope that makes sense.
Let me see if this addresses your point. I might, maybe not, but let me give it a try. Look, let's take the word beauty out of it. And let's think, when you are confronted with something disturbing, does it elicit the free play of imagination and understanding? Because it might not, right? Lots of representations, artistic descriptions, depictions, whatever, give us lots of horrible things in interesting ways, in ways that are powerful, important, do all kinds of things. There's one specific way that Kant is concerned with, and that is when the artist has done it in such a way that it really pushes you beyond your conceptual functioning, right? You really are kind of floundering conceptually. The specifics, be it a movie, be it an opera, be it a dance, the actual specifics are such that you just don't function as normal, right? You don't have the what he calls determinative judgments. And so I don't know if it helps just to take the word beauty out and say, look, he's talking about those cases. Why is he talking about those cases? Because those are the cases where we can, in this really bizarre way, have a commonality with others. Namely, we all have the capacity and exercises of free play of imagination and understanding.
No, I mean,
But
sorry.
also, just one last thing, we all agree that our pleasures are different. So our other pleasures, our sensory, agreeable, what have you pleasures, they're all different. And so all he's saying is, in a way, here's a kind of pleasure that actually we all of our exercises, as different as they may be, all in a way belong to our common humanity as exercises of free play of imagination, understanding. And those are the ones he's concerned with. But I think they have to, it seems to me, leave a lot of what you're saying and are interested in, and that's aesthetically valuable, out.
No, that's perfect. That definitely answers my question. I would actually put beauty in, and I'd say what interests me is beauty. But I think my discomfort, and I think you addressed that by saying that in some cases, it's possible that these represent expressions of these aesthetic ideas. Some of these aesthetic ideas could be done in a way that gets us beyond, right? And I think that kind of captures, because it does seem to me like Kant, and the way I'm thinking about it, does talk about beauty, but it just strikes me like the aesthetic ideas of most of these kind of negative aesthetic ideas simply won't do that for me. They might do it for other people. So when they see a bacon, they might have that experience. I will just never be able to have it. So it might be, again, individual tastes that make the difference there. So, but I don't want to take too much time because I feel like,
Okay.
sorry,
Well,
but thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So we have one more question, maybe two, and we're past the 1 hour mark. So let me remind everyone, we'll meet again June 5th, if you have to leave, June 5th for Ryan Doran. And Sonia, if it's okay with you, can we hang out for another 5 or 10 minutes?
Yeah,
Iris.
I'd love to. Sure. Thank you.
Iris,
Iris.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Nice to see you, Professor Sedivy, again. Just a very brief question that maybe goes slightly next to what you are doing rather than at the core of it. But I do want to ask you towards the end, and when you are kind of very, let's say, you basically say we can legitimately differ with respect to the objects that we find beautiful. And I just want to press you a little bit on how far can we extend in disagreeing, and particularly from the point of view of our disagreements with respect to the judgments about art. Because when you consider some of the contemporary interpretations of Kant's views about art, right, and particularly given the 52nd paragraph, when he's very explicit that art has to given the aesthetic ideas, that it has to kind of touch upon the audience's moral ideas. It seems that there is a very clear line with respect to the, let's say, the tasks that art is supposed to do within the society, particularly if you have in mind the notion of intersubjectivity and bringing different cognizers together. So how much of this disagreement can we share as an aesthetic community and still have this purpose of art, which kind of unites people and then even enables them maybe to move together towards the moral progress that Kant wants art to achieve? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. You brought up the M word, which I was staying away from. So I sort of see Kant's work in the following way. I think there's a main line of argument. That line of argument concerns and is that main line of argument, let's say, concerns the nature of the judgment and its conditions. So the free play, purposiveness without a purpose, a specific way in which it's not subsumable conceptually, all of that stuff. I think that there is a leitmotif that Kant has in this work, and the leitmotif has to do with morality. I think that, so I don't want to say it's subsidiary, or not the main line. It's much more like in a piece of music, yes, where you have the main melody and integrated with it is a leitmotif. So the leitmotif is important, nevertheless, it's the leitmotif. And so I think that Kant's view about disinterestedness, and if I could give you like an architectural mapping, right, we'd have the main line, and then we'd see Kant kind of coming up and up and up, inserting stuff about morality, interpolating it. So I am more interested in the main line. Okay, so my reading is fine with the main line. What about Kant's sort of the leitmotif with respect to morality? I'd like to keep it as soft and as much of a leitmotif as possible. Yeah, I don't want to elevate it maybe as much as you do, right? I mean, he wants it. He's passionate about it. It's important to him. But as far as the work of the critique of judgment goes, I think it is playing a subsidiary role. So, I mean, it would be great to have a conversation about this in more detail. I know what I've said is very dissatisfying, but I'm at least trying to explain that I think the way the aesthetic judgment functions, it is linked to morality, but in a really super subtle way. Like really, I think it's the fact that we experience our freedom in those experiences, in the free play, that is really important preparatory ground and importantly related to our capacity to make free moral judgments, where that's so important and constitutive and everything. But I guess I don't myself put Kant's thinking about some of his more substantive thoughts about morality right into the main line about aesthetic judgment. So I guess all I'm saying in a long-winded way is I'm disappointing you, I guess. But maybe it's a good thing if he's at odds with us there, right? Because it's the leitmotif, and people like me can go keep going. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm going to rudely ask the last question unless somebody has another question. I'm mindful of the fact that people have other things to do, but I'm going to ask a question that's most likely to make me look completely ignorant of Kant. I have a few questions to ask. The way you talk about aesthetic ideas enticing imagination to go beyond rational understanding, and this expansion of understanding that's ineffable sometimes, that it can't quite be captured in thought or language. It doesn't have a determinate content. This is where I'll sound like I don't know Kant well enough. It sounds like it makes the beautiful remarkably similar to the sublime in certain ways that might not preserve that important difference between the beautiful and the sublime in Kant's philosophy. It comes, I mean, some words that would seem perfectly apt for explaining the aesthetic dimension of free play and aesthetic ideas would be bewilderment or awe, and some of these other terms that we tend to think of as a mark of the sublime rather than the beautiful. I'll stop with that.
So, so I have to confess that I have quite a deep ignorance of Kant on the sublime because I really dislike it, so I don't read it. So there's my very honest disclaimer. So what I do know of the sublime that would make it at least somewhat different from the free play is precisely the dimensions of things like power and awe and so on, because that just need not and is not in a case of free play, right? There isn't this dimensionality of power. So I should come clean here. I'm quite taken by feminist critiques of the sort of 18th, 19th century sublime. You know, as a friend of mine said, oh, so you're made to feel small and powerless by something. Wow, get over it. You know, but that's a real caricature, and it's by a wonderful esthetician, but I won't say her name here, right? So, you know, some of us are just not really all that empathetic, and I know I'm being a brute here, and I'm being really brutishly ahistorical. I do love the 18th century, but I just kind of somehow draw my limit at the sublime. So I'm sorry, John, I have nothing of value to say, really, when it comes to the sublime. I just think that the power dimension and the awe dimension and the fear dimension, they just, I think, separated from the free play.
Well, a final round of applause, at least. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful paper with us. That was a wonderful discussion. Thanks to everyone for coming. We will see you again for the final meeting of the summer, June 5th. Have a good day. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.